You can't afford to invest, my sister scoffed, dismissing me from the table. As the boardroom chuckled, I jotted a note. $94 million. That was the secret total I had poured into her company. They mocked my cheap clothes, unaware I paid for the lights above them. But when the CFO's phone rang with news that their silent partner was pulling every cent, the laughter died. They were not ready to hear who really owned them. My name is Reagan Boyle, and for the last 45 minutes, I had been functionally invisible. I sat at the far end of the long, boat-shaped table, my back to the panoramic view of the city skyline that Luminary Grid Systems paid $30,000 a month to possess. The 32nd floor was designed to intimidate. It was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and Herman Miller chairs that cost more than the Honda Civic I had parked 3 blocks away to avoid the valet fees. The air conditioner hummed with the scent of ozone and expensive espresso, the smell of new money trying desperately to smell old. My sister, Sloane Calloway, stood at the head of the room, framed by the bright white light of a projector screen. She looked every inch the tech goddess she had convinced the world she was. She wore a structured cream suit that probably cost $3,000. Her hair pulled back in a severe, sleek ponytail that pulled her features into a permanent expression of focus and ambition. She was mid-speech, her hands chopping the air with practiced precision as she spoke about scalability and disruption. I adjusted the cuffs of my navy blazer. It was from a rack at a department store, 5 years old, and slightly frayed at the wrist. I caught my father, Leonard, eyeing the loose thread with a microscopic wince before he turned his adoring gaze back to Sloane. To everyone in this room, I was Reagan the charity case. Reagan, the little sister who worked for a non-profit saving wetlands or feeding orphans. They never remembered which, because they never cared enough to ask. I was the good heart of the family, a euphemism they used to mean financially irrelevant. The valuation we are looking at for the next round is not just a number, Sloane said, her voice dropping an octave to convey gravity. It is a testament to our dominance in the energy sector. We are talking about raising $50, maybe $70 million in fresh capital. This is not a bake sale. This is not a grant application. Her eyes flickered toward me for a fraction of a second when she said, grant application. A tiny, sharp hook meant to catch my skin. I did not flinch. I just took a sip of the lukewarm water in front of me. Reagan, Sloane said suddenly, breaking her flow to address me directly. The sudden silence in the room was heavy. You look confused. I know this is a lot of jargon. I set my glass down on the coaster. I am following. Sloane, you are discussing the pre-money valuation for the Series C round. A ripple of amusement went through the room. It was not a kind laugh. It was the sound of serious people indulging a child who had learned a big word. Right, Sloane said, a tight smile stretching her lips. Technically, yes. But Reagan, honey, this is a game of hundreds of millions of dollars. You do not have the context to understand the leverage we are dealing with. I invited you today because Mom thought it would be nice for you to see what we actually do here. But frankly, you are looking at this like it is a foreign language. You cannot afford to understand this, let alone invest in it. My father, Leonard, cleared his throat. He sat to Sloane's right, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. He had spent the last 5 years telling anyone who would listen at the country club that his daughter was the next Elon Musk, conveniently forgetting he had another daughter entirely. Sloane is right, sweetheart, Leonard said, his voice dripping with that patronizing softness he always used on me. It was the voice one used for a slow child or a frightened pet. This is high-level strategy. It is a bit beyond the scope of your allowance. Maybe you want to wait in the reception area? They have those nice magazines you like. This conversation is going to get very technical regarding the cap table and dilution. It is a bit above your pay grade. My pay grade. I suppressed a dry laugh. My father thought I made $45,000 a year coordinating volunteers. He had no idea that the chair he was sitting in, the lighting fixtures above his head, and the very lease for this office space were effectively paid for by my signature. I am fine here, Dad, I said. my voice even. I will just listen. I promise not to interrupt the big business talk. Miles Carter, Sloane's fiancé and the company's self-appointed chief operating officer, leaned back in his chair. He was a man who wore success like a costume, flashy watches, teeth whitened to a blinding shade, and a habit of using corporate buzzwords to mask mediocrity. He spun a pen between his fingers, looking at me with a smirk that made me want to foreclose on his future. "Let her stay." "Leonard," Miles said, though his eyes were mocking. "It is educational. Hey, Reagan, quick quiz. Do you even know what a Series D round implies compared to a Series C? Or do you think series is just something you watch on Netflix?" The room erupted in polite, sycophantic laughter. The board members, the legal counsel, the junior analysts, they all chuckled. It was the price of admission to Sloane's court. Laugh at the sister. Feel superior. Keep your job. "I assume," I said, keeping my face perfectly blank, "that a Series D would imply you burned through the Series C capital faster than anticipated and need a down-round bridge to survive. Or you are preparing for an IPO and need to bloat the valuation. But in Luminary's case, given the burn rate I noticed on the handout, I would guess you are terrified of running out of cash in 6 months. The laughter cut off abruptly. Miles blinked. For a second, he looked like he had been slapped with a wet fish. Then Sloane clapped her hands, shattering the tension. "Cute," she said, dismissively. "She reads Investopedia. Very cute. But let's get back to reality. Shall we? People who actually write checks are waiting." She clicked a button on her remote. The slide on the screen changed. A massive pie chart appeared, showing the current ownership structure of Luminary Grid Systems. There were thin slices for the founders, a slice for the employee option pool, and then a massive, dominant chunk of the pie colored in deep navy blue. Next to that massive chunk was the text, "Lead Strategic Investor, Northbridge Equity Group." I stared at the screen. I stared at the name I had created 5 years ago at a kitchen table while eating instant noodles, specifically so my family would never know I was the one saving them. "Northbridge," Sloane said, her voice softening into reverence. "Our anchor. They have been with us since the seed round. They get it. They understand vision. They do not nitpick over pennies like the small-time angels. They see the billion-dollar potential." "Do we have a representative from Northbridge joining us?" a new board member asked. He was an older man, heavily jowled, wearing a suit that cost more than my father's car. "Northbridge is private," Miles interjected quickly, trying to sound authoritative. "They are a silent partner, very exclusive. They trust Sloane implicitly. They do not feel the need to micromanage because they know who is flying the plane." I took a slow sip of my water to hide the smirk that was threatening to break through. They trust Sloane implicitly. That was rich. Northbridge did not trust Sloane. Northbridge had ironclad covenants in the investment agreement that gave it the power to strangle this company if the governance went sideways. I knew this because I had written them. I looked around the room. 12 people. 12 highly paid, highly educated professionals. Not a single one of them had ever successfully dug into who was behind Northbridge Equity Group. They saw a Delaware LLC, a generic address, and a wall of lawyers, and they just assumed it was some faceless conglomerate or a family office from old oil money. They were so blinded by the cash, so desperate for the validation of the $94 million I had pumped into this company over the last 4 years, that they never looked down. They never looked at the girl in the old navy blazer sitting at the end of the table. "It must be nice," Leonard mused, leaning forward to look at the chart. "To have that kind of backing. That is what happens when you are a genius. Sloane, people line up to give you money, unlike some people who think saving a stray cat is a career." He didn't look at me, but the insult landed exactly where he intended. "Northbridge is a strategic partner," Sloane corrected him, preening. "They are not just giving money, they are validating my leadership. They have put nearly $100 million into my ideas. That is not charity, Dad. That is respect." My phone buzzed in the pocket of my blazer. One short, sharp vibration. I ignored it. "Exactly," Miles said. And that is why we need to structure this new round carefully. We need to make sure we do not dilute Northbridge too much, but we also need to bring in fresh blood. We need investors who look good on a press release. He turned to me, his grin predatory. Sorry, Reagan, that means we need people with actual capital, not whatever it is you have. Good intentions? I am just here to learn. Miles, I said softly. Please, continue explaining how you plan to spend the money. My phone buzzed again, then a third time. Long, insistent vibrations against my hip. I slid my hand into my pocket and tilted the screen just enough to see it without drawing attention. The notification was from a contact saved as Avery, NB. Urgent. They are trying to bury the exclusivity clause in the new term sheet. We need to move, now. My heart rate did not change. My breathing remained steady. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, face down. So, Sloane said, turning her back to me to address the real people in the room, the strategy for the next quarter involves aggressive expansion into the Midwest grid. We are going to burn cash, but Northbridge has deep pockets. They will support us. I looked at the back of her head. I looked at the confident set of her shoulders. I looked at my father, nodding along like a bobblehead doll. I looked at Miles, checking his reflection in his watch face. $94 million. I had eaten ramen for dinner 3 nights a week for 2 years so I could roll my trust fund interest into the initial seed round. I had spent my nights studying forensic accounting while they were at galas. I had built Northbridge from a shell into a powerhouse specifically to support this family, to give my sister the chance she said she deserved. And now, I was sitting in a room paid for by my money, being told to go read a magazine because I was too poor to understand the conversation. Is something funny, Reagan? Sloane asked, whipping around. Apparently, my mask had slipped for a fraction of a second. No, I said, meeting her eyes. I was just thinking about Northbridge. You seem very confident that they will always be there. They are a business, Reagan, Sloane sighed, exasperated. They like making money. As long as I am CEO, they are not going anywhere. Now, please, if you cannot contribute, at least be quiet. I nodded slowly. I reached for my pen and opened the cheap spiral-bound notebook in front of me. I wrote down the date, I wrote down the time, and then, in clear block letters, I wrote, Option blackout. Proceed, I whispered. The phone in my pocket buzzed one last time. A final warning. I let it ring out. The room continued to talk about millions, unaware that the bank was sitting right there, and she was getting ready to close the account. To understand why I sat in that boardroom, letting them treat me like a piece of office furniture. You have to understand that I was not born invisible. I was made that way, layer by layer, over nearly 3 decades of polite, well-meaning neglect. Our house in the suburbs was a factory designed to produce 1 star, and production capacity only allowed for a single model. From the time we were old enough to speak, Sloane was the designated genius. I was the designated helper. It was a role assigned to me before I could even object, wrapped in compliments that felt like cages. I remember being 7 years old. Sloane had set up a lemonade stand, not just in front of our house, but she had convinced 3 other kids on the block to set up franchises. She took a cut of their profits in exchange for supplying the mix. My father, Leonard, laughed until he was red in the face, clapping his hands and telling the neighbors that his girl was a shark in training. He called her a future titan of industry. I was in the kitchen, squeezing the actual lemons because Sloane had decided the powdered mix was off-brand. My hands were stinging from the citric acid seeping into a paper cut when I brought the pitcher out. Leonard patted me on the head without looking down. Good girl. Reagan, he said, his eyes fixed on Sloane counting her quarters. You have such a servant's heart, always behind the scenes making sure things run smooth. That is a beautiful trait. A servant's heart. That was the brand they burned onto me. While Sloane was encouraged to be loud, to demand, to take up space, I was praised only when I was quiet, accommodating, and making someone else's life easier. There was never any violence. My parents were not cruel people in the traditional sense. We were a comfortable, upper-middle-class family with annual vacations to Cape Cod and a golden retriever named Buster. But emotional neglect is a subtle poison. It does not leave bruises. It just hollows you out until you wonder if you actually exist when no one is looking at you. Dinner conversations were the arena where I lost every night. I would try to talk about a book I read or a math problem I had solved in a unique way. I loved numbers even then. I loved how they made sense when people did not. But the moment I started speaking, Leonard would inevitably turn to Sloane. "Hold that thought, Reagan," he would say, though he never asked for the thought to come back. "Sloane, tell us about the student council budget proposal. Did you get the funding for the spring gala?" And I would stop. I would look down at my peas, and I would fade. Eventually, I stopped trying to interrupt. I learned that my role was to pass the salt, clear the plates, and smile while Sloane shined. The only person who saw me, who really saw the sharp edges beneath my soft exterior, was my maternal grandmother. Nana was a quiet woman who wore cardigans that smelled of lavender and old paper. The family ignored her much the same way they ignored me. They thought she was just a sweet old lady knitting in the corner. They were wrong. When I was 12, I found her at the kitchen table with a ledger in the business section of the newspaper. I sat down next to her, expecting her to ask me to fetch tea. Instead, she slid the paper toward me. "Reagan," she said, her voice crisp and completely devoid of the condescension my father used. "Look at this column. What do you see?" I looked at the stock prices. "Numbers," I said. "No," she corrected me. "Stories. Every number is a story of human behavior. Fear, greed, patience. If you understand the numbers, you understand the world, and if you understand the world, no one can ever control you." That afternoon was the beginning of my real education. While Sloane was at cheerleading practice or debate club, I sat with Nana. She did not teach me how to bake. She taught me how to read a balance sheet. She explained the difference between an asset and a liability, and she told me, with a strange intensity in her eyes, that money was not a goal. Money was a tool. It was a hammer. You could use it to build a house, or you could use it to break someone's fingers. The only difference was whose hand held the handle. I absorbed it all. I had a natural aptitude for patterns, for spotting the weakness in a financial structure, but I never told my parents. By the time I was in high school, the narrative was set in stone. Sloane was the brilliant leader. Reagan was the sweet, simple girl who volunteered at the animal shelter. They saw me volunteering and assumed that was the extent of my ambition. They did not know I was managing the shelter's operating budget by the time I was 16, reducing their waste by 15% and renegotiating their vendor contracts. To Leonard, I was just petting the puppies. "It is good you found your niche, Reagan," Leonard told me when I was accepted into the state university. Sloane, of course, was going to an Ivy League business school. "Not everyone is cut out for the rat race. You will make a wonderful social worker or teacher. Something gentle." I studied finance. I took advanced courses in forensic accounting and market theory. But when I came home for holidays, they never asked about my classes. They asked if I was dating anyone, or if I had made any nice friends. So I stopped offering information. I let them believe what they wanted. I told them I was interning at a nonprofit, which was technically true, but I omitted the part where I was working in their investment arm, not their soup kitchen. Graduation day was the final seal on the coffin of my relationship with them. We sat in the sweltering heat of the stadium. Sloane had graduated 2 years prior, and Leonard had framed her picture in the hallway before the ceremony was even over. She had given a speech about disruption and legacy. When my name was called, it was accompanied by the distinction summa cum laude. It meant I had the highest honors possible. I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, and looked for my family in the stands. They were clapping, politely. It was the golf clap you give to a stranger. Later, at the celebratory lunch, Leonard raised a glass of champagne. "To Reagan," he said, beaming, "for finishing strong, and to Sloane, for closing her first round of angel investment this morning, 2 successes in one day." The table erupted into cheers for Sloan. They spent the next hour dissecting Sloan's pitch deck. My diploma, with its gold seal, sat on the empty chair next to me, used as a coaster for someone's purse. That was the moment the scar tissue hardened. I realized that no matter what I achieved, I would never be enough to shift the spotlight. I could become the President of the United States, and Leonard would ask if I could get Sloan a tax break. Nana died 3 months later. She left me an envelope. I found it in her jewelry box, with my name written in her shaky spiderweb script. Inside was a letter, short and direct. Reagan. Do not tell them. They will not understand. And what they do not understand, they will take from you. Use this. Be smart. Wait until you are big enough to hold the hammer. A week later, the family lawyer asked to meet with me privately. He was a stone-faced man who had served Nana for 40 years. We met in a diner 3 towns over, far from where Leonard or Sloan might spot us. Your grandmother established a trust for you when you were born, he said, sliding a thick file across the Formica table. She contributed to it monthly. She made some very aggressive, very intelligent investments in the early 90s. Tech, pharma. She had an instinct. I opened the file. I looked at the number at the bottom of the statement. It was not a fortune that would buy a country, but it was $28 million. $28 million. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up at the lawyer. Does my father know? No, the lawyer said. The trust is structured specifically to bypass your parents. It is yours, solely yours. However, if you choose to disclose it, that is your right. I sat there, stirring my cold coffee, and thought about my family. I thought about Leonard's desperate need to vicariously live through Sloan's success. I thought about Sloan's reckless ambition, her belief that the world owed her capital. If I told them, Leonard would weep with joy. He would take over. He would start managing it for me. He would funnel it into Sloan's projects, into vacation homes, into cars to show off at the club. He would pat me on the head and say, "Don't worry your pretty little head about the math. Reagan, we will take care of it." They would drain me dry and tell me they were doing me a favor. No, I told the lawyer. They do not know, and they never will. From that day forward, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was Reagan the Saint. I took a job at a community outreach program. I wore cardigans and drove a used sedan with a dent in the bumper. I listened to my father make jokes about my poverty wages at Thanksgiving. I let Sloan buy me lunch and look at me with pitying eyes, telling me she wished I could afford a better haircut. But by night, I was someone else. I did not go to parties. I did not date. I sat in my small, rented apartment with 3 computer monitors glowing in the dark. I read annual reports like they were novels. I tracked emerging markets. I taught myself the language of leverage and liquidity. I took Nana's $28 million, and I went to work. I became a ghost in the machine. I watched the world of money move, and I learned how to move with it. And every time Leonard made a joke about my cheap shoes, or Sloan rolled her eyes when I couldn't split the bill at an expensive restaurant, I didn't get angry. I just went home, logged into my secure terminal, and watched my net worth tick upward. I wasn't just saving money, I was building an arsenal, and I was waiting for the moment I would need to use it. The $28 million my grandmother left me did not just sit in a bank account collecting dust and interest. Capital that sits still is dying capital. Nana had taught me that money was a tool, but I quickly learned that it was also a living thing. It needed to be fed, exercised, and directed. By the time I was 24, I had transformed that inheritance into the foundation of something formidable. I established Northbridge Equity Group. I did not want a family office, and I certainly did not want a vanity project with my name plastered on the door. I wanted a ghost. I worked with a specialist legal team in Delaware to construct a labyrinth of holding companies and anonymous trusts. If anyone dug into the ownership of Northbridge, they would hit a wall of non-disclosure agreements and proxy directors. My name was nowhere near the letterhead. To the outside world, Northbridge was a boutique private equity firm focused on high-impact technology startups, run by a board of seasoned, albeit tight-lipped, professionals. My boss, Avery, was actually my first hire. He was a brilliant, disillusioned former hedge fund manager who was tired of Wall Street politics and happy to be the public face of a fund where the real decisions were made by a woman in her pajamas at 2 in the morning. This was the architecture of my double life. To my family, I was Reagan the plotter. I worked at the community center, organizing food drives and filing grant applications for after-school programs. They saw me come home tired, wearing comfortable shoes and driving my dented sedan, and they assumed I was exhausted from the emotional labor of caring for the poor. In reality, I was exhausted because I had spent until 3 o'clock in the morning analyzing pitch decks and dissecting balance sheets, while Sloan was out networking at cocktail parties, clinking glasses with potential partners. I was listening to earnings calls on my headphones. I devoured books on venture capital structure. I subscribed to expensive financial data terminals that cost more than my annual salary at the nonprofit. I found mentors online, anonymous forums where serious investors debated the merits of SaaS multiples and hardware margins. I was sharpening a blade they did not even know I was carrying. Then came the day Luminary Grid Systems was conceived. It was a rainy Tuesday in November. Sloan had texted me, demanding I meet her at a high-end coffee shop downtown. She was vibrating with energy when I arrived, her eyes bright with the manic intensity of a founder who thinks she has just invented fire. "I have an idea," she said, before I had even taken off my raincoat. "Reagan, this is it. This is the unicorn." She slid a thick, spiral-bound document across the marble table. The cover read, "Project Smart Grid Integration." "I need you to look at this," she said. I felt a spark of surprise. "You want my opinion on the business model?" Sloan laughed, a sharp barking sound. "God, no. I mean, it is sweet that you want to help, but no. I need to know if you met anyone useful at that charity gala you worked last week. Any donors? Anyone with deep pockets who might be bored with philanthropy and wants real returns?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and opened the document. I ignored her dismissal and started reading. The idea was raw, but it was undeniable. Sloan proposed a software layer that could sit on top of aging electrical infrastructure and use machine learning to balance loads in real time. It addressed a massive pain point in the market. The grid was old. Renewable energy was fluctuating. The utilities were desperate. However, the financials were a disaster. I flipped to page 20. "Sloan," I said, pointing to a graph. "Your customer acquisition cost here is estimated at $500, but for enterprise sales to utility companies, the sales cycle is 18 months. Your burn rate will eat you alive before you close your first contract. You need at least 3 times this amount of initial runway." Sloan snatched the binder back, looking annoyed. "This is just a draft. Reagan, the numbers are placeholders. I am selling the vision. Investors buy the dream, not the spreadsheet." "Investors buy the ability to not go bankrupt," I said calmly. "And you have no governance structure here. Who makes the decisions? You have assigned yourself 80% of the voting rights with 0 vesting period. No serious institutional money will touch a cap table that looks like a dictatorship." Sloan rolled her eyes, leaning back and crossing her arms. That familiar look of pity washed over her face. "Reagan," she said, sighing, "look, I know you balance the checkbook for the soup kitchen, and that is great, really, but this is venture capital. This is the big leagues. You do not understand how these deals work. It is about momentum. It is about hype." She took a sip of her latte and delivered the line that would echo in my head for 5 years. "Honestly, you can't afford to invest, so you don't really need to worry about the details. This is a game for big money. Just stick to your little community angel work. You are good at being supportive." I looked at her. I saw the arrogance, the total lack of respect for the discipline required to actually manage capital. But I also saw the product. The product was a goldmine. It just needed a babysitter. I went home that night and called Avery. "We are going in," I told him. "On what?" Avery asked. "The biotech firm in Boston?" "No," I said. "My sister's project, Luminary. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Avery knew the situation. He knew about the family dynamics. Reagan, are you sure? Mixing business with family is usually a bloodbath. Mixing secret business with family is a nuclear bomb. It is a good product. Avery, it fits our thesis. High impact, scalable technology, but we are not writing a blank check. I want terms. I spent the next 48 hours drafting a term sheet that was a work of art. We offered to lead the seed round with $3 million. In the world of early-stage startups, $3 million was a lifeline that could turn a concept into a company, but the money came with strings, steel cables, actually. I included a Series A ratchet to protect our equity if the valuation dropped. I demanded a board seat for Northbridge, and most importantly, I inserted a specific clause regarding strategic governance and withdrawal rights. The clause stated that if the company failed to meet certain governance standards, or if the founding team acted in a way that materially damaged the relationship with the strategic investor, Northbridge had the unilateral right to withdraw its capital or transfer its entire stake to a third party of its choosing without board approval. It was a kill switch. When Avery sent the offer to Sloan, she didn't even blink. She saw Northbridge Equity Group and $3 million, and she saw the validation she craved. She didn't ask who Northbridge was. She didn't ask to meet the partners. She assumed we were just another faceless fund dazzled by her brilliance. She signed the papers without negotiating a single clause. I remember sitting in my living room, refreshing my banking app. I watched the transfer initiate. $3 million moved from my holding account, routed through a trust, and landed in the fresh, empty bank account of Luminary Grid Systems. My phone buzzed a minute later. It was a text from Sloan in our family group chat. Sloan, huge news. Just closed a lead investor for the seed round. Northbridge Equity Group, major players. They absolutely loved my pitch. Dad, we are going to celebrate tonight. Leonard, that is my girl. I knew they would see your genius. This is the start of an empire. Leonard, Reagan, you should come to dinner. Sloan can tell you what it is like to deal with real sharks. I stared at the screen. I was the shark. I was the water. I was the boat. And they were splashing around in the kiddie pool thinking they were swimming the English Channel. That initial $3 million was the catalyst. Because Northbridge had a reputation for rigorous due diligence, which was true, because I was obsessive, other angel investors saw our name on the capitalization table and assumed the company was solid. They followed our lead. Sloan raised another $2 million within a week, purely off the momentum I had created. Luminary Grid Systems was born. I went to the celebratory dinner that night. I wore my fraying blazer. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu because Leonard made a joke about splitting the bill evenly. I listened to Sloan brag about how she had charmed the partners at Northbridge, how she had wrapped them around her little finger. They didn't even ask for a board seat meeting, Sloan laughed, swirling her wine. I think they just trust my instinct. They know a winner when they see one. I cut into my chicken, hiding a small vaquero's smile. That is amazing. Sloan, I said quietly, it sounds like you have everything under control. I had not just invested in a company, I had purchased an insurance policy against my own erasure. Every light bulb that flickered on in their new office, every server they rented, every salary they paid, it all started with the money they said I didn't have. I looked at Sloan, glowing in the adoration of our parents, and I thought, you can forget me, you can dismiss me, but the math never forgets, and right now, I own the math. The timeline of a startup is not measured in years, but in burn rates and milestones. After the seed round, Luminary Grid Systems stopped being a project and started being a phenomenon. The $3 million I had injected acted like high-octane fuel. Sloan hired a sales team of 20 aggressive closers. She moved the operation from a co-working space to a dedicated floor in the financial district. The press ate it up. They called Sloan the Queen of Digital Energy. There was a profile in a major tech magazine featuring a photo of her standing on a wind turbine, looking visionary and windswept. My father framed it, naturally. He hung it in the hallway right next to the front door, so the mailman, the plumber, and every guest would have to acknowledge it before taking off their coat. "Look at that," Leonard would say, tapping the glass. "That is what leadership looks like. She is changing the world." I was changing the world too, or at least my corner of it, but my victories were quiet. I was successfully keeping the local youth center open despite budget cuts, but that didn't come with a glossy photo shoot. 18 months after the seed round, the inevitable happened. Luminary needed more money. The initial $3 million was gone, consumed by aggressive marketing and bloated salaries. It was time for the Series A. Sloan was looking for $15 million. She pitched to several firms on Sand Hill Road. She got meetings. Certainly, she was charismatic and the metrics looked good on the surface. But the terms they offered were predatory. They wanted too much equity. They wanted to replace her as CEO. So, Northbridge stepped in again. I sat in my apartment, staring at the term sheet. Avery, my partner at Northbridge, called me. "This is a heavy concentration of capital, Reagan," he warned. "If we lead the Series A with $15 million, we are doubling down on risk. If she crashes, we crash." "She won't crash if we keep the leash tight," I said. "Draft the papers, but increase the liquidation preference. If the ship goes down, Northbridge gets paid out first." We wired the money, $15 million. That weekend, we had a celebratory dinner at a steakhouse where the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Sloan was radiant. She ordered a bottle of Cabernet that was older than I was. "It is incredible," Sloan said, swirling the dark red liquid. "Northbridge just gets it. Other investors were nagging me about unit economics and slowing down hiring, but Northbridge? They looked at the growth chart and wired the money the next day. They know that when you find a genius, you back them." I cut my steak slowly. "Did you ever meet the lead partner?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "The one who authorized the wire?" "No need," Sloan scoffed. "My lawyers talk to their lawyers. It is a modern relationship. Reagan, you wouldn't understand. In your world, you have to beg donors for $20. In my world, capital flows to talent like water flows downhill." Leonard raised his glass. "To talent," he boomed, "and to the fact that Northbridge is smart enough to ride your coattails, Sloan." I drank my water. The total was now over $18 million. The years blurred into a cycle of cash calls and growth spurts. I started attending some of the quarterly updates at Luminary, usually at my mother's insistence. She wanted us to bond. So I would drive to the city, park my Honda blocks away, and sign in at the front desk as a guest. Walking through the offices of Luminary was a surreal experience. I walked past ergonomic chairs that cost $1,200 each. I walked past a break room stocked with organic snacks and cold brew coffee on tap. I saw the abstract art on the walls. I paid for all of it. Every time I walked down a hallway, I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the nearest junior developer and say, "Do you like your paycheck?" I signed it, but I remained the silent observer. "This is my sister, Reagan." Sloan would introduce me to her executives. "She works in, what is it again? Community support?" "Nonprofit administration," I would correct gently. "Right," Sloan would say, already turning away. "She is just here to see the big city office. Don't mind her. She is harmless." Harmless, that was the word that stuck. By the time the Series B rolled around, the numbers had become astronomical. The company was expanding into 3 new states and had just signed a pilot program with a massive regional utility provider. To support the infrastructure, they needed $30 million. I provided it. But it wasn't just the major rounds. There were bridge rounds in between. Moments where cash flow got tight because Sloan had overspent on a marketing gala or a rebrand. $1 million here, $2 million there. Convertible notes that turned into equity. I covered every shortfall. I patched every hole in the hull of the ship so Sloan could keep standing on the deck pretending she was sailing on calm waters. By the time we began preparing for the Series C, the round that was happening today, my total exposure, counting the seed, Series A, Series B, and the various bridge loans sat at exactly $94 million. $94 million. It was an insane amount of money for a single entity to hold in one startup, but Northbridge was technically a syndicate leader, meaning on paper it looked like the money was coming from a pool of investors. In reality, 90% of it was mine, leveraged from the aggressive growth of my initial inheritance and other successful exits I had made over the years. But the more money I gave, the less respect I received. During the due diligence phase for the Series B, I was sitting in the conference room waiting for Sloan. The door was ajar. Sloan was in the hallway with Miles, her fiancé and COO. "Do we really need to explain the burn rate to the board?" Miles was asking. "It is just going to panic them. We just need to show them the top-line revenue," Sloan replied. "As long as the graph goes up and to the right, they stay happy. It is not like I have to explain it to Reagan. Can you imagine?" Miles laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "God, no. She would probably ask if we can use coupons to lower the server costs. She thinks a budget is something you use to buy glue sticks for orphans. She doesn't understand the concept of a runway." "She thinks runway is a fashion term," Sloan joked. "I love her, but she is so small. She lives such a small life." I sat in the conference room, staring at my hands, a small life. I had just finished structuring a complex derivative hedge to protect their foreign currency exposure, a move that saved the company $400,000 that quarter. But to them, I was just the little sister who needed coupons. The most telling moment, however, came from a board member named Thomas. He was one of the few outside investors who had come in during the Series A, riding Northbridge's coattails. We were at a mixer after a board meeting. I was standing near the cheese platter, nursing a seltzer. Leonard was nearby, holding court. "You know," Thomas said, swirling his whiskey and looking at Leonard, "it is fascinating how supportive Northbridge has been. They have participated in every single round. They never dilute. They always double down. It is almost personal." Leonard nodded vigorously. "They are loyal. They know quality." Thomas chuckled. "It is so loyal that I joked to my wife the other day. Is Northbridge a Callaway family office? It acts like family money. Silent, supportive, never asks questions." My heart stopped for a beat. I looked at Leonard. This was the moment. The moment where a smarter man might pause and think. The moment where he might look at his two daughters and do the math. Leonard scoffed, a loud, dismissive noise that drew eyes from across the room. "Family money?" Leonard laughed, shaking his head. "Thomas, look at us. We do well. But we are not $100 million fund well. And if this family had that kind of secret capital, I assure you, it would be in Sloan's name. She is the financier in the bloodline." He gestured vaguely in my direction without looking at me. "Reagan over there? She is a sweetheart, but she thinks a high-yield savings account is risky. If Reagan had access to Northbridge's money, she would probably donate it all to save the whales." Thomas laughed. "Fair point. Just a thought." They moved on to discuss golf handicaps. I stood there, feeling the cold glass of the seltzer bottle against my palm. If it was family money, it would be Sloan's. That sentence was the key. It wasn't just that they didn't know. It was that they were incapable of knowing. Their worldview was constructed on a foundation where Sloan was the sun, and I was a faint, distant moon. The idea that I could be the one holding the galaxy together was physically impossible for them to process. That was the moment I decided to let the Series C play out exactly as it was headed. I could have warned them about the new investors. I could have told them that the term sheet they were chasing was a trap that would strip them of control. I could have intervened as a sister. But they didn't want a sister. They wanted a silent partner. So I stayed silent. I let the $94 million sit in the background, a massive, silent weight that they were too arrogant to measure. I decided that if they wanted to treat me like a ghost, I would show them what happens when a ghost decides to haunt the house. I continued to drive my old car. I continued to wear my off-the-rack blazers. And I continued to sign the documents that kept their lights on, waiting for the day they would try to turn them off on me, that day. I knew, would be the most expensive day of their lives. The air in the boardroom had shifted. If the first hour was about self-congratulation, this next hour was about exclusion. The lighting seemed to get harsher, reflecting off the polished glass walls and the gleaming foreheads of the men in expensive suits. We had moved past the retrospective and into the future, specifically the structure of the Series C round. Sloane stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid with the kind of adrenaline that comes right before a massive payday. She clicked the remote, and the screen behind her shifted to a slide titled Cap Table Optimization and Strategic Consolidation. To get to the next level, Sloane began, her voice crisp. We need to shed the dead weight. We are in talks with the Titan Global Fund. They are interested in leading the Series C with a capital injection that will push our valuation to nearly $500 million, $500 million, halfway to a unicorn. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the room. My father, Leonard, let out a low whistle, shaking his head in sheer awe of his golden child. But, Sloane continued, her eyes scanning the room, Titan Global is demanding a clean house. They do not want a cluttered capitalization table. They want to ensure that the board and the voting rights are concentrated in the hands of those who are actually driving the value. They want skin in the game to mean something significant. She nodded to Miles, who sat up straighter, adjusting his silk tie. This was clearly his moment to play the bad cop, a role he relished because it made him feel powerful. We are proposing a new bylaw, Miles announced, his eyes sliding over the faces of the junior board members before landing, with heavy significance, on me. Effective immediately upon the signing of the new term sheet, we are implementing a capital access policy for board attendance and voting proxies. Put simply, if your aggregate contribution to the company does not exceed $20 million, you revert to a non-voting, non-attending class of shareholder. He paused for effect. This ensures that the people in this room are the ones with serious risk on the table, the big boys. I sat perfectly still. The irony was so thick I could taste it like metal on my tongue. $20 million. That was the bar they had set. They had no idea that I had cleared that hurdle years ago. By my count, I had cleared it 4 times over. Miles turned his chair slightly to face me directly. His smile was thin, stretching across his face like a rubber band about to snap. So, Reagan, he said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. I know you like coming to these meetings. It is a nice day out for you, but under the new rules, well, not everyone has the ticket to ride. $20 million is a steep entry fee. The room went quiet. They were watching the slaughter. It was a sport to them. I looked at Miles. Is that the only criterion? I asked, keeping my voice level. Capital contribution? What about operational insight? What about historical support? Money talks. Reagan, Miles chuckled. And right now, yours is whispering. Actually, it is not even whispering. It is silent. He is right, honey, Leonard chimed in from the other side of the table. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a gesture that was supposed to look paternal but felt like a suffocation. Reagan, listen to your father, Leonard said, his voice booming slightly, performing for the audience. We are talking about high finance here, serious stakes. Well, look at your situation. You are driving that Honda Civic that sounds like a lawnmower. I visited your apartment last week, and the radiator was rattling. You are making, $45,000 a year at that center? My stomach tightened. He was using my poverty, a poverty I had chosen, a poverty I maintained specifically to funnel money into this room, as a weapon to discredit me. There is no shame in honest work, Leonard continued, twisting the knife. But let's be realistic. You are living paycheck to paycheck. You worry about the price of gas. You clip coupons. You are not equipped for a room where we burn $100,000 in legal fees just to draft a memo. This is out of your depth. It is not just about the money. Reagan, it is about the mindset. You have a scarcity mindset. Sloane has an abundance mindset. It is okay. Dad, Sloane said, stepping in to deliver the final blow. She walked over to where I was sitting and placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy and cold. "Reagan," Sloane said, looking down at me. "I love you. You know that. But you can't afford to invest. You can't afford to be here. You don't have the financial capacity. You don't have the network. And frankly, you don't have the stomach for the risks we take. You are a good person. You are kind. You save puppies and help the homeless. That is beautiful. But this?" She gestured around the glass-walled room, at the skyline, at the men in suits. "This is not your world. You are a tourist here." A few people chuckled. The general counsel covered his mouth to hide a smile. Miles didn't bother hiding his. He was grinning openly. "We will still invite you to the Christmas party," Miles said. "Just maybe leave the business talk to the adults." I sat there for a moment, letting the laughter wash over me. I looked at my father, who was nodding in agreement with Sloane's assessment of my worth. I looked at Sloane, who was already turning back to her presentation, confident that she had dealt with the nuisance. I took a breath. I mentally opened the ledger in my mind, the emotional balance sheet, and I entered this moment as a liability they could never repay. "Before we move on," I said, my voice cutting through the lingering chuckles. It was not loud, but it was projected with a clarity that made Sloane stop mid-step. "I had a question about the slide on page 14, I said, tapping my notebook. Sloane sighed, an exaggerated exhalation of breath. "Reagan, we really need to—" "The churn rate for the enterprise clients," I continued, ignoring her. "You listed it at 2%, but if I look at the revenue retention cohorts, the expansion revenue from existing clients is flat. That implies you are losing older clients at a rate closer to 8% and masking it with new acquisitions. If your cost of acquisition is rising, which it is, by 12% quarter over quarter, and your retention is bleeding, then this $500 million valuation is built on a leaky bucket. How exactly does Titan Global feel about that churn?" Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. The CFO, a man named Ethan Briggs, looked up from his tablet, his eyes widening. He looked at me, then down at his data, then back at me. He knew I was right. He knew because he had probably been trying to hide that exact number. Leonard looked confused. "What is she talking about?" "She is just throwing out buzzwords she heard on a podcast," Miles said quickly, though his voice lacked its usual swagger. "Churn, retention. She doesn't know what they mean in context." "I think I do," I said calmly. "And I think if you clean the cap table and restrict access to information, you are going to hide that leak until the cash position forces a down round. Is that the strategy? Pump and dump?" Sloane's face hardened. The mask of the benevolent sister vanished, replaced by the ruthless CEO. "That is enough," she snapped. "We are not going to waste the board's time debating amateur theories. You are looking at numbers without understanding the narrative. Reagan, as I said, this is not your world. Save the questions for your book club." She turned her back on me. "Ethan, next slide. Let's discuss the option pool." My phone buzzed against the table. It was a long, aggressive vibration that rattled the water glass. I looked down. The screen lit up. Sender, Avery, NB. Message. "The Titan term sheet just hit my desk. They are trying to bury the exclusivity clause. We are out of time. We need to decide on the option blackout before they lock the voting rights. Are you ready?" I stared at the message. Option blackout. It was the nuclear option, a clause I had written into the Series B bridge financing documents, buried deep in the chaotic legal jargon that Sloane never read. It defined a hostile governance event as any attempt by the company to disenfranchise the strategic investor or materially alter the voting threshold without unanimous consent. If triggered, it gave Northbridge, gave me, the right to immediate liquidity. It allowed me to demand the repayment of all principal and interest and to transfer any remaining equity to a designated distressed asset manager. It meant pulling $94 million out of the company in 24 hours. It meant collapsing the Series C. It meant the end of Sloane's reign as the queen of digital energy. I looked up at Sloane. She was pointing at a graph, talking about hypergrowth. She looked powerful. She looked invincible. She looked at me with total contempt. You can't afford to invest. I reached out and picked up my phone. I apologize, I said. Standing up, the chair scraped loudly against the floor. Sloane glared at me. Reagan, sit down. We are in the middle of… I have to take this, I said, holding up the phone. It is a work call. Leonard groaned, throwing his hands up. For God's sake, Reagan, is the homeless shelter running out of soup? Can't it wait? No, I said, smoothing the front of my cheap blazer. It is urgent. It is about a very large donation that is about to be withdrawn. Miles laughed. Go save the world, Reagan. We will handle the business. You do that, I said. I walked toward the glass doors. I felt their eyes on my back. Dismissive, annoyed, superior. They thought I was leaving to deal with a leaky pipe or a paperwork error for a charity. They thought I was fleeing the room because I was humiliated. They had no idea. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the hallway. The air was cooler here, quieter. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city. The cars down below looked like toys. The people looked like ants. I looked at the reflection of the boardroom in the glass. I could see Sloane gesturing. I could see Leonard laughing at something Miles said. They were toasting their future. I slid my thumb across the screen and answered the call. Avery, I said. Boss, Avery's voice came through, crisp and tense. I have the legal team on standby. Titan Global is pushing for a signature by close of business. If we don't move, we lose the leverage. I know, I said. So, Avery asked, do we play nice? Do we negotiate? I looked back at the boardroom one last time. I saw my father patting Miles on the back. I saw the way Sloane stood, so sure that she was the smartest person in the room, so sure that I was nothing. No, I said into the phone. We do not play nice. Initiate the option blackout. Are you sure? Avery asked. This burns the house down. Reagan, there is no coming back from this. They told me I couldn't afford to invest, I said softly, watching my sister smile. So I am taking my investment back, all of it. Understood, Avery said. I am sending the notice to their CFO now. And Reagan? Yes? What about the identity clause? Usually, we redact the principal owner's name on these notices. I paused. I watched Leonard laughing. Not this time, I said. Unseal the trust. Put my name on the header. I want them to know exactly who signed the check. Copy that. Executing now. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and took a deep breath. I stood there in the silence of the hallway, waiting for the chaos to start. Inside the room, they were still talking about millions, but in about 30 seconds, the only thing they would be talking about was me. The hallway was cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of egos inside the boardroom. I walked to the edge of the floor-to-ceiling glass, pressing my forehead briefly against the cold pane. 32 stories down, the city moved in a chaotic rhythm of yellow taxis and rushing pedestrians, oblivious to the fact that nearly $100 million was about to change hands in the sky above them. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady breathing of Avery on the other end. Avery was more than a partner. He was the architect of my anonymity. He was the only person in the world who called me boss, without a trace of irony. Talk to me, Avery, I said, my voice low. Give me the technicals. It is worse than we thought, Reagan, Avery replied, his tone stripping away the pleasantries. I have just finished reviewing the draft term sheet from Titan Global. They are not just asking for a board seat. They are structuring a complete recapitalization. They want to convert all existing preferred shares into common stock, stripping away the liquidation preferences we have built up over the last 5 years. If Luminary signs this deal, Northbridge gets pushed to the back of the line. We lose our seniority. We lose our withdrawal rights. Basically, our $94 million becomes captive capital. I watched a helicopter cut across the horizon. They are trying to dilute us into irrelevance. Exactly, Avery said. Sloan is so desperate for the $500 million valuation headline that she is willing to sell the foundation of the house to get a new coat of paint. She is trading control for vanity. If she signs that sheet, Northbridge becomes a passenger in a car driven by Titan Global, and Titan drives fast and reckless. She won't sign it, I said calmly, because we are going to trigger the option blackout. There was a pause on the line. Even Avery, who had seen me execute ruthless financial maneuvers before, hesitated at the name. The option blackout, Avery repeated slowly. Reagan, we haven't dusted that clause off since the hostile takeover of the logistics firm in Chicago 3 years ago. Are you sure the conditions are met? If we pull the trigger and the legal standing is shaky, they will sue us into oblivion. The conditions are met, I said. Walk me through the language of the Series B Bridge Agreement again. Section 14, Paragraph 3. I heard the ruffling of papers on the other end. Avery was prepared. Here it is, he said. Section 14, Subsection C, the withdrawal and transfer rights, colloquially known as the option blackout. It states that Northbridge Equity Group reserves the right to immediately recall all principal debt and force the transfer of equity holdings to a designated third-party liquidator in the event of a material governance failure. This includes, but is not limited to, the deliberate exclusion of the strategic investor from critical financial disclosures, or the implementation of policies that disenfranchise the investor based on arbitrary capital thresholds. I closed my eyes, letting the legalese wash over me. It was a beautiful trap, one that I had set years ago when Sloan had come to me begging for the bridge loan to cover a payroll shortfall. She had been so relieved to see the money that she hadn't bothered to ask what a material governance failure actually meant. She had just signed, grabbed the cash, and run back to her office to play CEO. They just triggered it. Avery, I said. 10 minutes ago, Miles Carter formally proposed and the board accepted a policy to restrict board access and voting rights to investors with over $20 million in capital. They explicitly stated that smaller stakeholders, which they perceive me to be, are to be excluded from high-level strategy meetings. By kicking me out of the room, even while knowing I am the proxy observer for Northbridge, they effectively formalized the exclusion of their largest creditor. They codified their own breach of contract. They walked right into it, Avery whispered. They didn't realize that by insulting you, they were legally defaulting on the debt. Precisely, I said. They thought they were just bullying a little sister. They didn't know they were violating a federal securities covenant. Okay, Avery said, his voice shifting into execution mode. So the trigger is valid. Now we talk about the payload. If we activate the option blackout, we are not just asking for our money back. The company doesn't have $94 million in cash to pay us. They are cash poor. All their value is in equity. I know, I said. That is why we use the transfer clause. Right, Avery continued. The clause allows us to transfer our entire stake, the debt, the equity, the warrants, to a pre-approved consortium. We have Helix Turnaround Group on standby. Reagan, you know who Helix is? They are not investors. They are butchers. They go into distressed companies, fire the management, strip the assets, and sell the intellectual property to the highest bidder. If we transfer our position to Helix, Sloan is not going to be CEO by Monday morning. She will be lucky if she's allowed to keep her laptop. I looked at the reflection of the boardroom again. Sloan was still standing there, pointing at the screen, confident, radiant, and utterly hollow. She had built this company on my back, used my money to buy her fame, and then turned around and told the world I was too small to matter. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about stewardship. Avery, I said. I sat in that room and listened to them discuss hiding churn rates. I listened to them plan to defraud new investors by masking their retention numbers. They are not just arrogant. They are incompetent. If I leave my capital in there, it will go to zero. Sloan is going to drive this company off a cliff. Transferring to Helix is the only way to salvage any value from the asset. I am not destroying the company. I am stopping them from destroying it further. It will look like a betrayal to your family, Avery warned. Your father? He is going to lose his mind. My father just told a room full of strangers that I have a scarcity mindset and that I am not equipped for the big leagues, I replied, my voice hard. He values success, Avery. He worships the winner. Well, I am about to show him who actually won. Okay, Avery said. I have the notice drafted. We are demanding immediate liquidity of the $94 million. Failing that, which is a certainty, we are executing the automatic transfer of all underlying securities to Helix Turnaround Group. I will copy the entire board, the general counsel, and the Titan Global due diligence team. Once Titan sees this notice, they will pull their term sheet faster than you can blink. Do it, I said. One last thing, Avery said. Usually, for a move this aggressive, we hide behind the corporate veil. We sign as the managing partners of Northbridge. Do you want to keep it that way? Do you want to stay in the shadows? I looked down at my cheap shoes. I looked at the frayed cuff of my blazer. I thought about the years of silence, the years of being the good helper, the years of being told I couldn't afford to understand. I had spent my entire life hiding my light, so Sloan wouldn't feel blinded. I had made myself small so they could feel big, and in return, they had tried to erase me completely. It was time to step into the sun. No, I said. Not this time. Unseal the trust. Avery, update the signature block. You want your name on the kill order? Avery asked. I want my name on the check, I corrected him. I want it in bold. Reagan Lynn Boyle, sole proprietor and managing director, Northbridge Equity Group. Make sure there is no ambiguity. When they read that email, I want them to know exactly who is evicting them. Understood, Avery said. I am hitting send in 10 seconds. You might want to go back in there. The fireworks are going to start the moment their phones sync. I am already walking, I said. I hung up the phone. I slipped it into my pocket. I smoothed my hair, squared my shoulders, and turned away from the view of the city. I walked back toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Through the glass, I could see them. They looked like a tableau from a magazine. The successful family, the brilliant executives, they were laughing. Miles was pouring water. Sloan was beaming. They were celebrating a future that no longer existed. I reached out and pushed the door open. The sound of their laughter washed over me, loud and confident. I walked in, not to the edge of the table where I had been banished, but toward the empty chair directly opposite Sloan. I sat down. I placed my hands on the table, and I waited for the notification sound that would shatter their world. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, sealing the sound of the city out and locking the suffocating atmosphere of the boardroom back in. Sloan was still standing at the head of the table, her hands sweeping across the projection screen like she was painting a masterpiece. She was mid-sentence, talking about a rocket ship growth curve and the paradigm shift that the new funding would secure. I walked quietly to my seat. I did not slouch this time. I did not try to make myself smaller. I sat down, placed my phone face down on the polished wood, and folded my hands. I was the only person in the room who knew that the rocket ship had just been stripped of its engine. The international expansion is just the beginning, Sloan declared, her eyes shining with the reflection of the charts. With Titan Global's capital, we are looking at a valuation that puts us in the top 1% of startups in this sector. We are not just building a company, we are building a dynasty. My father, Leonard, nodded vigorously, his face flushed with pride. Miles was leaning back, checking his reflection in the dark screen of his tablet, looking every inch the conquering hero. Then, it began. It started with a low, insistent hum. It was the vibration of a phone against the hard wood of the conference table. Ethan Briggs, the CFO, frowned. He reached for his phone, likely expecting a congratulatory text or a mundane update from accounting. He tapped the screen. I watched his face. I watched the blood drain from his cheeks in real time. It was like watching a light switch be turned off behind his eyes. He swiped up. He read. He scrolled. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Ethan, Sloane asked, noticing his distraction. Are we boring you with the victory lap? Ethan didn't answer. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. Excuse me, I need to take this. He didn't wait for permission. He practically ran to the door, fumbling with his phone as he exited. Sloane rolled her eyes, playing it off for the board. Finance guys, she joked. Probably a payroll glitch. Anyway, as I was saying, the strategic acquisition of the grid data. Through the glass wall, I could see Ethan in the hallway. He was not dealing with a payroll glitch. He was pacing frantically. He was holding the phone to his ear with one hand and gesturing wildly at the air with the other. I could see him shouting. Though the soundproof glass reduced his panic to a silent movie, he looked like a man watching his house burn down. Inside the room, a second phone buzzed, then a third. The general counsel, a stoic woman named Patricia, who rarely showed emotion, checked her smartwatch. Her eyebrows shot up. She immediately reached for her phone. "What is going on?" Miles asked, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Why is everyone checking their email?" "Something is happening," Patricia said, her voice tight. "I just got a priority alert from the corporate secretary." Another buzz, this one from the pocket of the board chairman. The rhythm of the room had broken. Sloane's voice, once the dominant force, was now just background noise to the rising cacophony of vibrating devices and tapping fingers. The confidence that had filled the air 60 seconds ago was evaporating, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Ethan Briggs burst back into the room. He didn't close the door. He stood at the end of the table, his chest heaving, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. "Sloane, stop," Ethan said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Sloane froze, her laser pointer hovering over a graph. "Excuse me? Ethan, we are in the middle of a board meeting. Sit down." "There is no board meeting," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "We have a problem, a massive problem." He walked to his seat but didn't sit. He threw his tablet onto the table. It slid across the surface and stopped in front of Miles. "We just received a formal notice from Northbridge Equity Group," Ethan announced. The room went dead silent. "They have activated the option blackout clause, effectively immediately." "The what?" Leonard asked, looking around in confusion. "Is that good?" "No, Leonard, it is not good," Ethan snapped, losing his patience. "It means they are exercising their right to immediate withdrawal of capital due to a breach of governance covenants." Ethan looked up, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of the board. "Northbridge is pulling out, all of it. They have issued a demand for the immediate repayment of principal and interest, and they are executing a forced transfer of their equity position." "How much?" the chairman asked, his voice low. $94 million, Ethan said. The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. $94 million, Ethan repeated, making sure the weight of it crushed everyone in the room. "That is the seed capital, the Series A, the Series B, the bridge loans, the operating cash. It is gone. As of 4 minutes ago, our primary credit facility has been frozen." Miles jumped to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. "That is impossible. They can't just do that. We have contracts. We have a relationship." "We have a contract that says they can do exactly this," Ethan yelled back, finally losing his composure. "I am reading the notice right now. Miles, it cites deliberate exclusion of the strategic investor from governance and arbitrary disenfranchisement based on capital thresholds. The policy you just pushed through, the one where we kicked the small money out of the room, that was the trigger. We handed them the gun, and they just shot us in the head." Sloane looked like she had been struck. She leaned against the podium for support. But Northbridge loves us. They are silent partners. They wouldn't destroy the company. We are about to sign with Titan Global." Titan Global just got CC'd on the notice. Patricia, the general counsel, said, looking up from her phone with a grim expression. "And so did our bank, and the audit committee. Titan isn't going to sign a term sheet with a company that is currently in default on $94 million of debt. The deal is dead. Sloan, it is dead. And it gets worse, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. They aren't just pulling the cash. They are transferring the remaining equity stake to a third party for liquidation management. Who? Miles demanded. Who are they selling us to? Helix Turnaround Group, Ethan said. A gasp went through the room. Even Leonard, who knew little about finance, knew the name Helix. They were the vultures of the industry. They didn't grow companies. They stripped them for parts. Helix? Sloan whispered. They will fire everyone. They will sell the IP. They will liquidate the brand. Yes, Ethan said. They will. And Northbridge has the legal right to do it because we technically violated the shareholder agreement 10 minutes ago. The panic was now total. People were shouting over each other. The chairman was calling his personal lawyer. Miles was pacing, swearing loudly. Sloan was staring at the screen, watching her rocket ship crash and burn in real time. I sat perfectly still. I took a sip of my water. I watched them scramble. I watched them realize that the big money world they worshipped was actually a house of cards that I had been holding up with one hand. And now that I had pulled my hand away, the gravity was crushing them. Why? The chairman asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Why would they do this? Northbridge has been with us for 5 years. They have been patient. They have been supportive. Why would they burn the house down over a bylaw change? It doesn't make sense. Unless... He stopped. He looked around the room, his eyes narrowing. Unless it was personal, the chairman said. This feels personal. This feels like someone was waiting for us to make a mistake. Who is Northbridge? Another board member asked, looking at Ethan. I mean, who is actually running it? We always deal with the lawyers or that guy Avery, but who is the principal? Who actually makes the call to kill a $100 million company in 5 minutes? Ethan looked down at his tablet again. He swiped to the bottom of the email, to the signature block that had always been redacted or generic in the past. The notice, it is signed, Ethan said, his voice trembling. Well, Miles shouted. Who is it? Is it a competitor? Is it a bank? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked up. He looked past Miles. He looked past Sloan. His eyes locked directly on me. It wasn't a conscious deduction. It was an instinct. It was the realization that in a room full of people screaming about money, the only person who wasn't panicking was the one person they had all agreed was worthless. Slowly, the silence spread from Ethan to the rest of the room. One by one, they followed his gaze. Sloan turned around. She looked at me sitting there, calm, composed, with my cheap blazer and my water glass. Ethan, Sloan said, her voice shaking. Who signed the letter? The room held its breath. The phones had stopped buzzing. The only sound was the hum of the projector fan, still displaying the slide of the glorious future that I had just deleted. I looked back at them. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just waited for them to hear the name of the person they said couldn't afford to be there. The silence that followed Ethan's gaze was heavy, physical, and suffocating. It felt as though the air conditioning had been sucked out of the room, leaving only a vacuum where 12 people were forgetting to breathe. Ethan looked down at his tablet again, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled to the bottom of the legal notice. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the stillness. The notice states, Ethan read, his voice thin and strained, that this withdrawal of capital and transfer of assets is being executed under the direct authority of the founder and sole beneficiary of Northbridge Equity Group. Well, the chairman barked, losing his patience. Stop stalling. Ethan, who is it? Who is the founder? Ethan looked up. He did not look at the chairman. He did not look at Sloan. He looked directly at me. The document is signed digitally and notarized, Ethan said. The founder of Northbridge Equity Group is Reagan Lynn Boyle. For a moment, nothing happened. It was as if the words were in a language no one in the room spoke. They hung in the air, foreign and unintelligible. Sloan stood frozen near the screen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes blank. Miles was mid-step. 1 foot raised to pace, and he just stopped, paralyzed. Then, the denial began. "No," Leonard said. He chuckled. A nervous, jagged sound. "No, that is a coincidence, a clerical error. Reagan Boyle is a common name." He looked around the table, begging someone to agree with him. "My daughter is sitting right there. She works at a community center. She makes $45,000 a year. She drives a Honda. This must be some other Reagan Boyle, some billionaire from New York or Silicon Valley." "It is not a mistake, Leonard," Ethan said softly. "It has to be." Leonard's voice rose to a shout, his face turning a mottled red. "Look at her! Look at her clothes! You think she runs a $100 million fund? She can barely pay her rent. I pay for her phone bill. I pay for her insurance." Ethan didn't argue. He simply turned the tablet around and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward my father. "Look at the attachment." "Leonard," Ethan said. "It is the original incorporation strategy document from 5 years ago. Look at the photo ID required for the Delaware filing." Leonard looked down. Sloane leaned over his shoulder, her movements jerky and mechanical. On the screen was a scanned copy of my driver's license. Next to it was a photo of me, 5 years younger, sitting in a home office surrounded by monitors, and below that was my signature, the same loopy, distinct signature I had used to sign birthday cards for them every year. "It is her," Ethan whispered. "It has always been her." Sloane pulled back as if the tablet were radioactive. She stumbled slightly, her hip bumping against the edge of the heavy table. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw true fear in my sister's eyes. Not stress, not anxiety, but fear. The fear of a person realizing the ground they are standing on does not exist. "This is a joke," Sloane croaked. Her voice was unrecognizable. "Reagan? This is some kind of sick joke, right? You put someone up to this. You hacked the email." I slowly picked up my glass of water. I took a sip. I set it down on the coaster with a deliberate, soft click. "It is not a joke, Sloane," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough to reach every corner of the room. "And I did not hack anything. I built it." "You?" Miles laughed, but it sounded like a cough. "You don't know the first thing about finance. You asked what runway meant 5 years ago." "I asked if you knew what it meant," I corrected him. "There is a difference." I stood up. The room flinched. 12 powerful people, captains of industry, flinched because the girl in the cheap blazer stood up. "Let me clarify the capitalization table for you, since you seem to have trouble reading it," I said, walking slowly toward the head of the table. 5 years ago, our grandmother passed away. You all thought she left nothing but a house full of old knitting supplies. You were wrong. She left a trust fund, $28 million. Leonard gasped. 20? She told me she had nothing." "She told you she had nothing because she knew you would spend it on sports cars and bad investments," I said, not looking at him. "She left it to me. She left it to the one person she knew would not use it to buy validation." I reached the front of the room. I stood next to Sloane. She looked small now, deflated. "I took that $28 million, I continued, addressing the board, "and I invested it. I traded derivatives. I leveraged emerging markets. I built Northbridge Equity Group from a shell into a fortress. And then, Sloane called me." I turned to my sister. "You called me to that coffee shop," I said. "You had a pitch deck and a dream, but you had no money and no discipline. You told me I couldn't afford to invest. You told me to stick to my charity work. So I did. I made Northbridge my charity work, and you were the needy cause." "The seed round," I said, ticking it off on my fingers. $3 million. That was me. I wired it from my living room while eating instant noodles. "The Series A," I continued, taking a step closer to Miles. $15 million. You were drowning in overhead. No one else wanted to touch you. I authorized the transfer because I believed the product was better than the management. "The Series B," I said, my voice hardening. $30 million, plus the bridge loans, plus the convertible notes you issued to cover your marketing overspend, plus the emergency credit facility I opened last Christmas so you could make payroll. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single person who had laughed at me an hour ago. Add it up, I said. 3, 15, 30, the bridges, the notes. It comes to exactly $94 million. That is the amount of capital Northbridge has deployed into luminary grid systems. That is the amount of money I have poured into this room. $94 million, I repeated. That is not a silent partner. That is the lifeblood of this company. I am not just an investor. Sloan, I am the reason the lights are on. I am the reason you have a job. I am the reason you are standing here pretending to be a genius. Sloan was shaking. Tears were pooling in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of humiliation. Why? She whispered. If you had the money, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me treat you like that? Why did you let Dad pay for your insurance? Why did you drive that awful car? Because I wanted to know, I said. Know what? Leonard asked, his voice trembling. I wanted to know who you were, I said. I wanted to know if my sister was building a company because she was brilliant or because she was lucky. I wanted to see if you could succeed on your own merits. But more than that, I wanted to see who you were when you thought I was nobody. I looked at Leonard. I wanted to see how you treated a daughter who couldn't buy you a country club membership, I said. I wanted to see if I had value to you simply because I existed, or if my value was tied to a net worth statement. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector fan. And you gave me my answer, I said. Every single day for 5 years, you mocked my clothes, you mocked my job, you mocked my life. You told me I was good, but irrelevant. You excluded me. You laughed at me. I turned back to Sloan. You sat there today, I said, gesturing to her chair. And you told me I couldn't afford to be in this room. You told me I didn't have the capacity to understand. You didn't just insult me. Sloan, you insulted the only person who was actually keeping you alive. I stayed silent, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Not because I had nothing to say. I stayed silent to see exactly how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing. And now that I have seen it, I am done paying for the privilege of being humiliated. Reagan, please, Sloan stammered, reaching out a hand. We can fix this. I didn't know. If I had known. That is the point, isn't it? I asked, stepping back out of her reach. If you had known I had $94 million, you would have treated me with respect. You would have listened to me. You would have loved me. I looked at her with pity. But you shouldn't have needed $94 million to treat me like a human being. Sloan, you should have done it because I was your sister. I looked at Ethan. Execute the transfer, I said. Northbridge is out. The realization that Northbridge Equity Group was not a faceless institution, but a woman sitting 6 feet away in a department store blazer, hit the room like a physical shockwave. The silence that had initially descended was now breaking, fracturing into the sharp, jagged sounds of panic. Sloan was the first to move, but she did not move toward me. She moved toward the projection screen, as if she could physically block the slide that detailed the transfer of assets. She looked at the numbers. The $94 million, the liquidation preference, the governance default, and I saw the color drain from her face until she looked like a ghost. She understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, exactly how fragile her kingdom was, without my capital. Luminary Grid Systems was not a rocket ship. It was a kite with the string cut. This destroys the Series C, Sloan whispered, her voice trembling. Titan Global will never sign. If Northbridge pulls the capital, we are insolvent. We can't make payroll next week. Reagan, do you understand what you are doing? You are not just withdrawing money, you are killing the company. I am not killing it, I said, leaning back in my chair. I am placing it under new management. Miles Carter, ever the opportunist, shook off his paralysis. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He realized that shouting would get him nowhere. He needed to salvage the deal, and to do that, he needed to massage the ego he thought I had. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked around the table, putting on his best salesman smile, though it twitched at the corners. "Reagan," Miles said, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay. Let us all take a breath. Clearly, there has been a massive breakdown in communication. We made assumptions. We were wrong. We own that." He pulled out the chair next to me, the one he had previously told me I wasn't qualified to sit in, and sat down, leaning in close. "But let us be rational," Miles continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial level. "You are a businesswoman. You built Northbridge. Impressive. Seriously, Reagan, I am floored. But business is about negotiation. You don't want to torch your own asset. That $94 million is your money. If you send us to Helix Turnaround Group, they will strip it. You will take a haircut on the value." "I have factored in the loss," I said coldly. "I am willing to lose 30 cents on the dollar to ensure the asset is no longer mismanaged." Miles winced. "But why lose anything?" "Look, you want respect? You want a seat at the table? We can tear up the bylaw right now. We can give you a board seat. Hell, we can make you vice chair. We will put your name on the website. Reagan Boyle, strategic co-founder. How does that sound? We can structure a salary, a package, a corner office next to Sloan." I looked at him. He really thought that was what I wanted. He thought I was throwing a tantrum because I wanted a shiny title and a plaque on the door. He couldn't conceive that I didn't want to be part of their club. I wanted to evict them from the building I owned. "I do not want an office, Miles," I said, "and I certainly do not want a title that you think you are gifting me. I already own the table you are sitting at." "Reagan, please," Leonard interrupted. He was standing now, gripping the edge of the table, his face a mask of anguish. But it wasn't the anguish of a father who had hurt his child. It was the anguish of a man watching his trophy shatter. "You cannot do this to your sister," Leonard pleaded. "Think about the family. Think about what people will say. You are going to bankrupt your own flesh and blood? Over what? Because we didn't praise you enough? Because we teased you about your car?" "Is that what you think this is?" I asked, looking at my father. "You think I am dissolving a $94 million position because you made fun of my Honda?" "Then why?" Leonard demanded, tears actually forming in his eyes. Tears for Sloan. Always for Sloan. "Why are you being so vindictive? You are destroying her dream. You are ruining everything she worked for. We are a family. Reagan, families support each other. They don't pull the rug out from under each other. I have supported this family to the tune of 8 figures for 5 years, I said, my voice steady but sharp as a scalpel. I supported her when no one else would. I supported her when the bank said no. I supported her when her burn rate was suicidal. I stood up again, turning to face Leonard fully. "You talk about family," I said. "But where was the family when you told the entire board I was too poor to understand the conversation? Where was the family when you let them laugh at me? You didn't defend me. Dad, you joined in. You used my perceived failure to highlight Sloan's success. You built her pedestal out of the bricks you took from my self-esteem." "We didn't know," Leonard protested weaky. "If we had known you were Northbridge, if you had known I was rich, you would have treated me better." I finished for him. "And that is exactly why I am doing this. Because I shouldn't have to be a millionaire to be treated with basic dignity by my own father." "This isn't about dignity," Sloan screamed. The sound tore through the room. Sloan had abandoned her post at the screen. She stormed toward me, her face flushed, her composure completely gone. She looked wild, cornered, and dangerous. "This isn't about feelings, Reagan," Sloan yelled, pointing a finger at my chest. "This is about my company. My company. I built this. I stayed up all night coding the original prototype. I flew to Tokyo to close the chip deal. I hired these people. I built this culture." She hit her chest with her hand, a hollow thump against the expensive fabric of her suit. "You just wrote checks." Sloan spat the words out like they were poison. "That is all you did. You sat in your dark little apartment and wired money. You didn't bleed for this. You didn't sacrifice your life for this. You are just the bank. You are just the wallet. And now you think you can take my child away from me just because you paid for the supplies? The room went dead silent again. Sloane was panting, her chest heaving. She felt justified. She felt that her labor, her face on the magazine covers, her sleepless nights, gave her a moral ownership that superseded any contract. "I am the visionary," Sloane hissed. "You are just the silent partner. You are nothing without my idea." I looked at her. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt a profound, cold clarity. "You call this company your child," I said softly. "It is," Sloane challenged. "Okay," I said. "Let us use that metaphor. You birthed the idea, you nurtured it, you showed it off to the neighbors, you took all the credit for how tall it grew." I took a step closer to her. "But from the day it was born," I said, "who paid the hospital bills? Who paid for the food it ate? Who paid for the clothes it wore? Who paid for the roof over its head when it was sick and dying?" Sloane stared at me, her mouth twitching. "I did." I answered my own question. "I paid for everything. When you overspent on marketing, I covered it. When you needed to hire engineers you couldn't afford, I paid them. When you needed a bridge loan because you mismanaged your cash flow, I wrote the check. You didn't raise this child. Sloane, you just played with it while I paid the tuition. And now," I continued, "I am looking at the parent, and I see someone who is reckless, someone who is arrogant, someone who is willing to defraud future investors to keep up appearances. So, as the person who paid for every single thing in this building, I am calling Child Protective Services." "That is what Helix Turnaround Group is," I said. "They are the foster care system, and they are going to take the company away from you before you kill it." "You can't," Sloane whispered, but the fire was gone. She looked at Ethan Briggs, the CFO. "Ethan? Tell her she can't just take it." Ethan looked down at the table. He looked defeated. "She can, Sloane," Ethan said quietly. "She owns the debt. She owns the preferred equity. She has the voting majority on a liquidity event. Legally, she is the company. We just work here." A heavy sigh came from the other end of the table. It was the board member who had asked about Northbridge earlier, the one who had noted the family money connection. He stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Ms. Boyle," he said, nodding to me with a newfound respect. "Or should I say, managing director. Your logic is sound. Governance is the bedrock of valuation. If the current leadership is excluding its primary capital partner based on personal bias and shallow optics, that is a fiduciary breach. You are right to trigger the transfer. It is the only responsible move to protect the asset." "Thank you," I said. "Traitor!" Miles snapped at the board member. "It is not treason, Miles," the man said calmly. "It is business. And frankly, I would rather deal with Helix than with a management team that judges its investors by their shoes." Sloane sank into a chair. She looked around the room, realizing the tide had turned. The board members were no longer looking at her as the queen of digital energy. They were looking at her as a liability. They were looking at her as the woman who had insulted $94 million until it walked out the door. "Reagan," Sloane said, her voice small, broken. "Please, I will do anything. I will step down as CEO. I will take a demotion. Just don't send us to Helix. Don't let them chop it up. Let's keep it in the family. Please, we can work this out." I looked at her. I remembered the way she had looked at me an hour ago. "You can't afford to invest. You don't have the capacity." "I am sorry, Sloane," I said. "But my decision is made. The transfer notice has already been sent. Helix will have a team here within 24 hours to begin the transition. You are choosing money over family." Leonard wept. "No, Dad," I said, picking up my phone and turning to leave the room for the last time. "I chose family for 5 years. I chose family to the tune of $94 million. Today, I am finally choosing myself." I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard the sound of Sloane sobbing. a raw, ugly sound of total defeat. I heard Miles trying to shout into his phone, trying to find a lawyer who could stop a tidal wave. I didn't look back. The silent partner had finally spoken, and the echo was going to bring the whole building down. Ethan Briggs held his phone up, the screen illuminating the sweat that had gathered on his forehead. The room was no longer a place of business. It was a crash site, and we were all just standing in the wreckage waiting for the dust to settle. "It is confirmed," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "The lead syndicate banks have received the liquidity notice from Northbridge. They have frozen our revolving credit lines pending a risk assessment, and I have a confirmation from Helix Turnaround Group. They have formally accepted the transfer of the securities. They will have a transition team on site in 24 hours to assume operational control." 24 hours. That was how long Sloane had left to be the queen. The reaction in the room was fractured. Miles was shouting into his phone, threatening lawsuits that he knew he could not afford. Sloane was staring at the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. But the board members, the seasoned investors who had seen companies rise and fall before, were quiet. I saw the board member who had spoken up for me earlier exchange a look with the chairman. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. They realized the truth. Luminary Grid Systems was a good product run by a bad management team. Northbridge's move, while brutal, was actually saving the underlying asset. By handing the company to Helix, I was cutting out the cancer, my sister's ego, so the patient could survive. They knew that under Helix, the company would be leaner, meaner, and profitable. It just wouldn't belong to the Callaways anymore. Sloane seemed to feel the power shift in the room. The air of invincibility that had surrounded her for 5 years evaporated, leaving behind a terrified woman who was watching her identity dissolve. She walked toward me. She did not strut. She did not pose. She walked with the heavy, frantic steps of someone who had run out of options. "Reagan," she said. Her voice was cracked, stripped of all its corporate polish. "Reagan, please, I am begging you." It was the first time in my adult life that I had heard my sister beg. "I messed up," Sloane said, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. "I was arrogant. I was cruel. I judged you because I thought you were weak. I thought you were just drifting through life while I was building something real. I didn't know you were the one building the foundation under my feet." She reached out, her fingers hovering near my arm, but not daring to touch the cheap fabric of my blazer. "I am sorry," she sobbed. "I am so sorry. I will change. I will give you a seat on the board. I will listen to you. Just call Avery. Tell him to stop the transfer. Don't let Helix take my company. Don't let them take my baby. Please, Reagan, give me a chance to fix this." I looked at her. I saw the sincerity in her eyes, and I believed her. I believed she was sorry, but I also knew that her sorrow was born of consequences, not conscience. She was sorry because she had lost. She was sorry because the person she stepped on turned out to be the floor she was standing on. I stayed silent. I turned my head slowly to look at my father. Leonard was sitting in his chair, slumped over, looking 10 years older than he had when the meeting began. He was watching Sloane cry. His face twisted in a mixture of shame and confusion. "Dad," I said. He looked up at me. His eyes were red. "I have a question," I said, "and I want you to answer it honestly. For once in our lives, just tell me the truth." Leonard nodded weakly. "If I were not Northbridge," I asked, my voice steady, "if I were just Reagan, the social worker, if I didn't have $94 million, if I was still just the girl in the Honda Civic with the rattling radiator, and Sloane told me I wasn't good enough to sit in this room, would you have defended me?" The room went silent. Sloane stopped crying for a second, holding her breath. I waited. I watched his eyes dart around the room, looking for an escape, looking for a way to spin this, but there was no spin left. The facts were laid bare on the table. "Would you have stood up for me?" I repeated. "Would you have told her to treat me with respect? Or would you have sat there and laughed?" Leonard opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his hands. He started. Then his voice failed. He took a breath and whispered the truth that broke whatever bond we had left. I probably would have stayed silent. I nodded. It didn't hurt. It felt like a weight being lifted off my chest. The hope was gone, and with it, the disappointment. "Thank you," I said. "That is all I needed to know." I turned back to Sloane. She was looking at me with wide, hopeful eyes, thinking that maybe this emotional moment was a prelude to forgiveness. "I am not withdrawing the notice, Sloane," I said. Sloane recoiled as if I had slapped her. "What? But he admitted it. We are being honest. Doesn't that count for anything?" "It counts as closure," I said. "But it doesn't change the business reality. You are not a capable CEO. Sloane, you manage by ego, not by data, and you manage by exclusion, not by talent. I have $94 million at risk here. I am not going to leave it in the hands of people who only respect me when they find out I own the bank." "However," I said, raising my voice slightly so Ethan and the board could hear me clearly, "I am not a monster. I am not you." I pulled my phone out. "I am adding a stipulation to the transfer agreement with Helix," I announced. "It is a condition of the sale. Helix must guarantee the employment of the entire engineering team, the operations staff, and the support personnel for a minimum of 12 months. No layoffs for the rank and file. If they want my equity, they keep the workers." Ethan looked up, surprised. That will reduce the valuation of the transfer. It will cost you millions, Reagan." "I don't care," I said. The receptionist didn't laugh at me. The coders didn't mock my clothes. They are innocent. I am punishing the leadership, not the labor. I looked at Miles. "That protection does not apply to the C-suite. You and Sloane are on your own." Sloane let out a scream of pure frustration. The mask of the repentant sister vanished instantly, replaced by the fury of the entitled queen. "You are a traitor!" she shrieked, her face twisting into something ugly. "You are betraying your own family. How can you sleep at night? You are doing this out of spite. You are selfish." "Selfish?" I asked, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "I have spent 5 years living in the shadows so you could shine," I said. "I spent 5 years eating cheap food so you could have a runway. I spent 5 years letting you treat me like dirt so I could secretly pay your bills." I reached down and picked up my spiral-bound notebook, the one where I had written option blackout an hour ago. "I have done everything for this family," I said. "I bought your career. I bought Dad's pride. I bought this entire illusion." I smoothed the cover of the notebook. "This is the first time in 5 years that I'm doing something for myself," I said. "And if that makes me selfish, then I am fine with that." I turned away from her. I turned away from Miles, who was slumped in his chair looking at a future of unemployment. I turned away from Leonard, who was staring at the table, realizing he had bet on the wrong horse for 30 years. I walked toward the glass doors. "Reagan!" Sloane yelled after me. "Reagan, don't walk away. You can't just leave us like this." I didn't stop. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the hallway. The silence was immediate. The thick glass cut off Sloane's screaming, turning it into a mute, frantic pantomime. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder. Inside the room, the phones were ringing again. People were standing up, arguing, pointing fingers. The chaos of the collapse was in full swing. They were trying to save their reputations, trying to salvage what was left of the deal. But out here, in the corridor, it was quiet. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting long golden shadows across the carpet. I walked toward the elevator. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel joyful. I just felt light. The burden of being the invisible pillar holding up their sky was gone. I was no longer the silent partner. I was no longer the little sister. I was Reagan, and I was free. I pressed the down button. I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow. Maybe I would buy a new car. Maybe I would finally take a vacation. Or maybe I would just go to the park and read a book without worrying about burn rates and cap tables. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside and turned around. Through the narrowing gap of the doors, I saw the boardroom one last time. I saw them fighting over the scraps of the empire I had built and then dismantled. The doors closed, severing the connection forever. My revenge wasn't the destruction of the company. It was the simple, undeniable fact that I had the power to walk away, and they had no choice but to stay and watch me go. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know your location and what you thought of Reagan's decision. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people.